Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. This is a solo episode, and tonight I'm going to be responding to the Lord of Spirits, specifically Father Stephen DeYoung, but also Father Damick is also included in this response a little bit too. The reason I'm responding to them is that they mentioned me in an episode of theirs from a while back. It's taken me a while to get around to it, but I am going to make a response video to them. I should also say that this isn't going to hopefully be mean-spirited or too critical. The subject of this response video is Athanasius an iconoclast? And I will be defending my argument that Athanasius is in fact an iconoclast. Although I think that part of the reason and motivation for Athanasius's iconoclasm is different than what most people might think or expect. So that's going to be the main subject of this video. And this is also an invitation to Father Stephen DeYoung for more conversation on this topic. I'd like to have a conversation with him again sometime soon. I'd like to talk to him about the prologue of the Gospel of John. My presentation that I gave at the UCA conference in October dealt with the Gospel of John, specifically the prologue, chapter 1. And I actually had a little bit of back and forth with Father Stephen DeYoung on my paper before I presented it. Obviously, that doesn't mean Father Stephen is endorsing my take on the prologue of the Gospel of John, but he did interact with me a little bit on that, and so I'm grateful for that. So I wouldn't mind a conversation to delve a little bit more deeper into that, and we could also talk about Athanasius's iconoclasm if we wanted to do that too. And I should say that Father Stephen DeYoung and I tend to have a conversation every March. We had one in March 2023 and March 2022. And so now it's March 2024, so it must be time again. I wanted to make this video after he was done with his Symbolic World conference stuff that he recently did in Florida, because I assume that that was, of course, grabbing a decent amount of his attention and time. And hopefully he's had a chance to get back home and relax from that. And then there was this video that dropped today between Stephen DeYoung and Gavin Ortlund on the Transfigured Life channel. I was unaware of the Transfigured Life channel before. I can't help but feel like that they're stealing a little bit of my thunder with their channel title, but I'm just going to assume that they came to that title independently of my own channel. But in any case, all the more attention to the Transfiguration, the better, in my opinion. So let me, without any further ado, let me play the clip that from the Lord of Spirits podcast that is sort of the cause for this episode. Let me make sure all the sound and everything is looking good. Okay, here we go.
Yes. And so there's just this presupposition that there's and I hear even very intelligent people I know from that background make these kind of comments like, St. Athanasius here, see, he condemns idolatry and he doesn't mention Christian iconography, so he must have been an iconoclast.
Yes, actual argument being made recently by someone.
By an intelligent person.
Very excited. Yes, I got very excited about his argumentation.
Yeah, not by a dumb person, by an intelligent person. And that's sort of like saying, well, this church father condemned the pagan Roman emperor and didn't mention bishops, so he must be an anarchist. Right? Like, those don't follow. Right? A bishop and a pagan emperor who declares himself to be a god, they're both authority figures, okay? Right?
And they're religious authority figures.
Yes, they're both religious authority, because the emperor was the Pontifex Maximus of the Roman cult, right? He was the high priest of the Roman cult, right? So there are some superficial similarities, right? But there are also much more major differences in how these roles are completely conceived of. And the same is true when you actually get into it about idolatry and iconography.
Okay, it goes on from there. So this very excited, but also apparently very intelligent person would like a chance to respond to that. I feel like anytime I'm specifically called out in an episode, that certainly entitles me to make a response. In case you're wondering, Sam, how do they know it was you? I emailed with Father Stephen just to double extra confirm that was me that he was talking about. So what clip are they talking about? Let's play the clip of me and Hank talking about Athanasius, and I'll just let you hear for yourselves before I preload any preconceptions about what I said. So here is me and Hank talking about Athanasius in our first of 4 episodes on Athanasius.
Thing that I think is interesting, and I'm going to poke the Catholics and Orthodox with this a little bit, is that I'm pretty sure that all of Athanasius's arguments would also support him being an iconoclast. It's not like he says, you pagans, you guys make idols, whereas we Christians, we just make icons and images. Also remember, the word image and idol in Greek is the same word, right? Icon is the word for idol and image in Greek. So when he's criticizing their images, he's criticizing their icons. And he never once says, we Christians have a much better way of venerating our icons, but you guys worship your idols or something like that. And in fact, there's even a place where he's talking about sophisticated philosophers who try and defend their idolatry. And they make an argument. I'll just read this passage. This is from chapter 19 on Against the Heathens. As to
I'll come back to that passage later. I wonder if, so it sounds like Lord of Spirits heard me say that Athanasius condemns idolatry but doesn't defend Christian iconography. Therefore, he's an iconoclast. And I certainly said something like that. But I felt like my argument was many of the arguments that Athanasius gives against pagan idolatry would seemingly cut against Christian iconography as well, if he did believe in Christian iconography. And the fact that his reasons for condemning pagan iconography aren't then followed up by a response defending Christian iconography shows that he was probably an iconoclast. That's a slightly more nuanced argument than just an argument from silence. Like if I am trying to defend some political position that, we need to, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. If you're criticizing your opponent and your criticisms of your opponent could backfire on you, and you don't then take a way to disambiguate why your arguments against your opponent don't fall back on yourself as well, then that either suggests that you're a bad arguer, that you're unaware of this consequence, or that you don't think that the arguments that you're making fall back on you. So I think I was making a slightly more sophisticated point than Lord of Spirits was giving me credit for. If I didn't articulate myself the best, I'm sure that the fathers of the Lord of Spirits podcast certainly understand that when you and your co-host host a conversational podcast, that sometimes you don't always articulate yourself in the most clear and on the nose pointed way. And that, it's not like a perfect syllogism that comes out, but we expect our audience to interpret us in good faith. So if they think that I'm so smart, and like I'm not looking for compliments about my intelligence, but if they think I'm so smart and made a stupid point, maybe perhaps they should scratch their heads to make sure that they didn't misunderstand my point or didn't grasp all of the points of the point. So just in case it wasn't clear enough from that single episode quote, I am going to be responding and defending the idea of Athanasius being an iconoclast, including the argument that he criticizes pagan iconography in a way that would also seemingly criticize Christian iconography if it were to exist, which therefore seems like an argument that he did not have any such practice that he felt like he needed to defend or to be wary of criticizing in his criticisms of pagan iconography. I thought about making this episode basically as like a giant takedown of icon veneration in general, but I don't think I'm going to do that. There are a decent number of episodes that already do that. I'll just play a quick clip from one that I particularly enjoy. This is Gavin Ortlund. I feel like he has a pretty good video on Christian iconography. Sorry about that. Sorry for the bang. And so I'll just play a little bit of this in the beginning that I think is particularly helpful from Gavin in this whole icon discussion.
First section, what is venerating icons? The word icon just means image, but the thing we have to understand is that it has a technical meaning. So an icon is a work of art, usually two-dimensional, though there are some three-dimensional, and often, though not always, it'll be a portrait of a singular person, sometimes Christ, sometimes Mary, sometimes another saint. I'll put up a few pictures here, a famous icon of Christ, and then a famous icon of Mary as well. What we just have to get is that icons are distinct from religious art generally. They serve a special liturgical purpose. In Eastern Orthodox contexts especially, you'll often hear them called sacred images or windows into heaven. They have a kind of mediatorial role that I'll explain here. But let me just first say, trying to be as fair as I can, that this is grounded in the incarnation. Christ is the image of the Father, and so there's this idea that revelation takes place in both word and image. Here's how it's put in one important text by two Eastern Orthodox theologians. The icon is placed on a level with Holy Scripture and with the cross as one of the forms of revelation and knowledge of God in which divine and human will and action become blended. So that's a little interesting final little phrase there. By the way, this is why the rejection of venerating icons is often seen as a denial of the truth of the incarnation. But that last sentence there, in which divine and human will and action become blended, this gets us into the role a little bit. Essentially, to try to be simple here, icons function as a point of access to the realm of divine glory and light. Okay, what is manifest in Jesus's transfiguration, the divine light, the divine glory, the saints are participating in that now. That is that realm is reflected. Now you have to be careful here. Here's how that book puts it: the icon is not a representation of the deity, but an indication of the participation of a given person in divine life.
So this idea that icons are sort of like this mediatorial role or object that can bring us into the divine realm, a window into heaven, and that contemplation, and not just contemplation of the icon, but veneration, which can involve bowing, kissing, lighting of candles in the direction of, even lighting incense in the direction of or at the altar of, and all of these other sorts of practices. There's a big distinction between having religious art in your church, I think. Like, imagine you have a stained glass window that shows the transfiguration of Jesus, and many Protestant churches will have such things, but you don't ever like interact with it in this sort of religious object sense where it is serving this theological contemplation activity. This is what I think makes Eastern Orthodox and Catholic icon veneration distinct from anything that I think that Protestants are comfortable with. And I think that Gavin just did a pretty fair job of explaining that. Maybe I'll give him a little bit more time to talk.
And so as a point of access to that realm, as a window to heaven, it becomes a means for us to strive after participation in God. As they put it, the icon is both the way and the means. It is prayer itself. Now,
so icon as a means and a way into heaven. It's not a depiction of the God the Father or the highest deity, but it is depictions of people who are in heaven, and thereby gives us access into heaven. And again, it's not just looking at it and admiring its beauty. It is this sort of liturgical, interactive, spiritual practice, bowing, kissing, all the stuff that I already mentioned. So I would recommend watching the rest of this video from Gavin. I actually think it's quite good. I really don't think I disagree with pretty much anything he says. He's got lots of church father quotes, lots of history, some church councils, some, various other things, and talking about the iconoclasm scandals later in the church and all of that sort of stuff. So I thought about making a video, but I'm like, I really don't have a ton to say on the high level stuff that Gavin hasn't already said. I mean that as a compliment, for the record, Gavin. I might be a little bit critical of Gavin at a certain point later in this video, but for now, Gavin, I'm on Team Gavin with respect to that. There's also this other really good article that I found. It's by John B. Carpenter. It's in the Gospel Coalition. I'll include a link to that in the description. It's called Answering Eastern Orthodox Apologists with Regards to Icons. It goes through and defines what an icon is, saying similar things to what Gavin just said. Was Second Temple Judaism really aniconic? And it has some really interesting stuff. Here's like one quote that I'll read. I know that Father Stephen DeYoung often brings up the practice of having religious art in synagogues. And again, I feel like probably one of my biggest criticisms of Father Stephen DeYoung, and I will play a quote from Gavin again later in his conversation that was posted today with Father Stephen DeYoung. I think Father Stephen DeYoung, to help convince me, I would say, of this icon practice, needs to help clarify the difference between religious art and venerated icons. Because like I said, it's one thing to have a stained glass window in your church that shows Jesus. It's another thing to have a painting of Jesus that people are kissing, bowing down to, praying at while they are looking at it, etc. And so this is and Stephen DeYoung, like I mentioned, will often show evidence from, say, the Second Temple period of various synagogues that might have had various decorations in them. But as far as I can tell, it's never the sort of thing that's like an icon that's actually being interacted with. And I think he often uses religious artwork to defend iconography. And I think he needs to do a little bit more work than he's done to really make that more convincing. So here's this quote from Josephus. Josephus is a first century Jewish historian who's writing after the temple was destroyed. Here's what he says. By night, he is Pontius Pilate. So by night, Pontius Pilate brought into the city busts of the emperor that were attached to the military standards. When our law forbids the making of images, doesn't say making of some images, but not other images. It just says the making of images. For this reason, the previous procurators used standards that had no such ornaments. So that's interesting. Previous Roman rulers had used standards that didn't have images of the emperor on them. The next morning, the Jews were indignant and hurried to Pilate in Caesarea, imploring him to remove the images. When he refused, deeming it an insult to the emperor, they prostrated themselves around the palace for 5 days and nights. On the 6th, Pilate took his seat on the tribunal in the stadium, and when the Jews again pleaded, he gave a signal. The people were suddenly surrounded with a ring of troops, 3 deep, their swords drawn, and Pilate threatened death if they did not stop the tumult. But they bared their necks, declaring that they would rather die than transgress the law. Astounded at such religious zeal, Pilate immediately transferred the images from Jerusalem to Caesarea. So that seems like a level of iconoclasm that is not just like, oh, hey, let's just have images willy-nilly. And yeah, one can make the argument the image of a Caesar is the image of a god because there was religious devotion to the emperor in the emperor cult. But that's not specifically really the reason that Josephus gives. He says that it's an image, and that's actually just the problem in and of itself. So it doesn't at any point say that Pontius Pilate was requiring the Jews to make sacrifices or any other sort of oblation or offering to this image. It just says that there was an image and that was the problem, even to the point of them willingly baring their necks, rather taking a sword to the neck rather than tolerating such a blasphemy. So I think Stephen DeYoung, sometimes he might cherry pick evidence from the Second Temple period about Jewish religious views of iconography and idolatry and veneration and worship. I also want to give a shout out to my friend Joseph. Joseph is a fan of this channel. Hopefully he'll watch this. He's been telling me, Sam, you make this veneration worship distinction in my video about Jesus. Should Jesus be worshipped? And he's like, I don't think there was really a clear veneration worship distinction at this point in time. And it's passages like this that make me wonder if he has a point. I still think that even in this passage, they prostrate themselves before Pontius Pilate. And so they're bowing to Pontius Pilate, not because they think he's a god, but because they're recognizing his authority, and they're pleading with him peacefully to stop this image practice in Jerusalem. So anyway, that's an interesting episode to keep in mind. I will say, just to give some of the pro-icon people their due, I saw this Twitter thread on Twitter. I don't know who this is, Scriptorium Press, and it says, iconography in the early church continued. The use and venerations of icons was by no means an exclusively Eastern phenomenon. We find plenty of examples of it in the West as well, image below. And then there's an image. Oh, it's from the 7th century. Is the 7th century the early church? That's not generally what I mean by the early church. Okay. And then he shows something, a quote from St. Augustine, but that's from 430 AD. That's not particularly early. Another quote from 431 AD, not particularly early. Quote from St. Jerome, 420 AD, not particularly early. A quote from Gregory of Tours, 594 AD, even less early. Elsewhere, St. Gregory writes, Christ is cherished with such love through a perfect faith that believers hang a painted image on him on visible boards in churches and houses. Well, when was that? Was that Gregory of Nyssa or some other Gregory? So anyway, a lot of these quotes are from the 4th, 5th, 6th, or even later centuries. So none of them are particularly early. I think, again, this points to the idea that this icon veneration was not there in the earliest centuries. I'll have some quotes from some church fathers later, but I'm specifically building up and building a context to focus on Athanasius himself and to defend the points that I was making about Athanasius in the article. But I think that some amount of greater context is helpful for this. So I'm going to play this other passage from the video, or this other clip from the video of Father Stephen DeYoung and Gavin Ortlund talking to each other. So lest anyone think that I don't like Father Stephen DeYoung, I actually do quite like Father Stephen DeYoung. I'm a regular listener of the Lord of Spirits podcast. I would love to meet him sometime. I'm jealous of all my friends who went to Florida. I thought the clip of him talking with Jordan Peterson about the resurrection was one of the most fascinating worlds collision sort of videos that I've seen, crossover videos in a while. So props to that. So here's a clip from the video that got posted today. Let me make sure the volume's good. Okay.
I think one of the difficulties that I already mentioned then is judging between interpretations of Scripture. If everything is revisable, right? So I know Dr. Ortlund doesn't, or at least he just said he doesn't want to revise anything about Nicaea 1. I know a person who identifies as a biblical Unitarian, who identifies as a Protestant. Most Protestants would not accept him as a Protestant, but who wants to revise Nicaea 1 and wants to revise it based on his reading of the Bible. And so while Dr. Ortlund is located within a historical Protestant tradition that very much accepts and endorses the earlier councils and the later ones finds more problematic, that division is based upon, again, a certain reading of Scripture, which is appropriate if you're sola scriptura.
So anyway, Father Stephen DeYoung he doesn't just give me negative shout outs. Was that a positive or a negative shout out? I mean, I think it was mostly a positive one. I will say there was one clip from Lord of Spirits where he also mentioned this friend, the biblical Unitarian, who has trouble fitting into churches and has trouble getting in, and gets frustrated when there are these people telling him to believe in the Trinity, but they don't really know what the Trinity is themselves. As long as there's just some tip of the hat to the Trinity, that's all they seem to want. I couldn't find where that clip was. I remember he said that at one of his episodes, and it was a very sympathetic thing. It really felt like he was sort of understanding the difficult situation I find myself in. So again, it's not like Father Stephen DeYoung and I have an antagonistic relationship. And I appreciate him bringing me up to Gavin Ortlund. I'll notice that Gavin Ortlund didn't seemingly have much facial expression response. I suppose maybe he was just taking notes. That would be the charitable thing. But I do appreciate people poking Gavin Ortlund about me. I bet he knew exactly who that friend that Father Stephen was talking about. It kind of reminded me of this moment when Paul Vanderklay was talking to Jordan Cooper. I'll play this clip.
One of the most interesting sheep in this little flock is a biblical universalist who
Universalist?
I'm sorry, biblical Unitarian. He's going to kill me for that.
I'm going to kill you, Paul.
Biblical Unitarian who studied at Cornell. And so when you mention Cornell, I know his ears are going to perk up at this and he's going to be interested. He'll probably invite you on his channel because he does have a very interesting YouTube channel. But tell me about what did you learn as a campus chaplain at Cornell? That sounds like a very interesting
I actually
space.
I've received emails from him. So
Oh,
I know
okay,
who
good.
he is. Yes. And
He's safe. He is safe. You can talk.
okay. Okay. Well, that's good to know. I'm a little like wary of, Unitarians, I me think Unitarians in Ithaca, that's a little bit of a hostile conversation most of the time.
I am not one of those Unitarians that you think of from Ithaca, New York, Jordan B. Cooper. I lived in Ithaca, New York for 4 years. I did not go to the Unitarian Universalist Church in Ithaca, New York for the same reasons, or for many of the same reasons at least, that he doesn't. I should say, okay, glad to know you got my emails, Jordan B. Cooper. Why? You could maybe have responded to them. That would have been a little bit nice. But there's this interesting thing. Why is it that these Protestant YouTubers are sort of hesitant to talk to me? I mean, I should say Paul Vanderklay isn't hesitant to talk to me, and he would count as a Protestant YouTuber too. He called me an interesting sheep. I'll take all the compliments I can get tonight. Super intelligent, excited person who makes bad arguments. Angry sheep. I'll take all the compliments. But I think that there's something interesting that Gavin and Jordan Cooper have in common about there's something very high stakes and a little bit risky talking to someone like me. And look, I perfectly well understand the reasons that, it's easier to talk to an atheist or something like that than it is to talk to me, that a lot of their audience would get mad at them for platforming heresy. And of course, my arguments are also quite awkward for some of their presuppositions and stuff like that. So how did Gavin, I mean, look, I really do want to talk to Gavin Ortlund. I would love to talk to Jordan B. Cooper. I won't pester him any more by email than I already had. He already knows the invitation's out there. He's welcome on my channel anytime. If you want to pester him in his comment section to talk to me, go right ahead. I've already sent my, I've already set my limit before I start to be annoying, I'm sure. So I won't be annoying to him. But so how did Gavin respond to that comment about the biblical Unitarian? Here's what he said.
Look to the scripture as the supreme North Star for how we locate that unrevisable body of teachings. And then from distinguishing among the ecumenical councils, Nicaea 1 to Nicaea 2, I would say we can do so, I would say clearly on the basis of scripture and also the early church. I would say the deity of Christ versus icon veneration, these are very different in terms of, I never want to be insulting, but I would say it's resounding in terms of the scriptural attestation to different directions on those two different issues. And I would say,
so that was something of a response. And I appreciate, he doesn't want to be insulting. I mean, he was less insulting than Father Stephen DeYoung and Father Andrew Damick were about my Athanasius video. So Gavin, I appreciate that. That was a little bit gentler than, many people try to be. And again, that's the topic that I want to talk to Gavin about, is what is this resounding deity of Christ clarity that he expects that he sees in the New Testament. And deity of Christ, what exactly does that mean? I mean, if you think that that's an unambiguous phrase, then the first couple centuries of Christian history show that that is by no means an unambiguous phrase, and that was the topic of conversation and was heavily debated. And my continued point is that there would be no one who had a Orthodox Trinitarian perspective on the quote-unquote doctrine of the deity of Christ until the late 4th century, and it has all of the hallmarks of an accretion that slowly developed over time. It's very similar to icon veneration. And actually, icon veneration and the deity of Christ are wrapped up together, because oftentimes the defense of icon veneration is connected with doctrines of the incarnation, like Gavin already mentioned in the video that I quoted earlier. So those topics aren't as disconnected as I feel like that quote sort of meant to say. But let's see here. I feel like, all right, Gavin and I were splitting apart in terms of us being on the same side a little bit in the beginning of this video. Then we were on different sides. All right, let's come back to me being on the same side of Gavin, because I feel like the point he makes here is quite good and very similar to my overall point of this video.
The issue with icons is not the presence of religious art in buildings or on the catacomb tombs or on engravings on furniture, anything like that. That's all not the issue. The issue is veneration of those images. And so that that would be the specific theology that is required and upon which anathemas are given at Nicaea II, praying through the icon as a window to heaven, a theology of figural representation. What's given to the image passes through it to the prototype. Okay, that practice is the target there that then we will need to get into in terms of the historical data for that. I'm firmly persuaded there isn't a historical case for that. I just don't. I think it's clear that that is a late accretion, slowly coming in late in the patristic era. But I know we'll have differences on that. But I just wanted to flag kind of that's where we'll need to kind of probe that issue.
Well said. I feel like I don't really have much to add to that quote at this time. All right, so I'm going to get into my slides. All right, so my main point will be building up to understanding that Athanasius's iconoclasm, while yes, rooted in the Old Testament and rooted in, the commandments, thou shalt not make any graven image and stuff like that, it's also connected to his theology of God and the eminence of God, and even his incarnational theology. And his iconoclasm is also connected to his mysticism, I would say, his spiritual practices, his contemplative spiritual practices that he believed was the pathway to growing closer to God. It's that theology of Athanasius, which is actually one of the main reasons which I think he was an iconoclast. And it'll take me a while to build up that argument. So I'm going to quote this passage from Irenaeus. Actually, I'm going to quote myself quoting that to just save my throat a little bit of work tonight. Here's a quote that I saved in my arsenal in case this came up, and I'm going to bust it out. This is from Book 1, Chapter 25. Okay. So he's talking about a certain variety of Gnostics. Others of them employ outward marks, branding their disciples inside the lobe of the right ear. From among these also arose Marcellina, who came to Rome under the episcopate of Anicetus, right? The episcopate is the pope, the bishop of, so he keeps track of the bishops of Rome. I'll throw you Catholics a bone on that. And holding these doctrines, she led astray multitudes. They styled themselves Gnostics. They also possess images, some of them painted and others formed from different kinds of material. While they maintain that a likeness of Christ was made by Pilate at the time when Jesus lived among them, they crown these images and they set them up along with images of the philosophers of the world, that is to say, with images of Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle, and the rest. They also have other modes of honoring these images after the manner of the Gentiles. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's that quote. And if I'm seeming a little snarky, just imagine I'd already been talking with Hank for over an hour and 40 minutes at that point, and sometimes that brings out a little bit of my snarky side. So as far as I can tell, this quote from Irenaeus in Against the Heretics, or Against All Heresies, is the earliest quote that I'm aware of where a specific picture of Jesus is ever mentioned in history. But it is not a positive depiction. Irenaeus, it was the Bishop of Lyon. He's also a doctor of the Catholic Church. Honestly, it amazes me that they made him a doctor of the Catholic Church, But that is exactly what I am led to believe means that his teachings are infallible, or if they aren't infallible, they're trustworthy or something like that. But yet he's clearly an iconoclast. So you have to understand this whole book that Irenaeus is writing is a catalog and a takedown of all of the Gnostic sects and heresies that he is aware of. And so when he's describing the practices of the Gnostics, it might not come across as strongly in an individual quote, but he means it with the highest level of condemnation. When he is looking at these various Gnostic sects and he's condemning their sexual behavior, their theological beliefs, and their other practices, it is with the strongest level of condemnation that I can possibly communicate right now. So when he says that these Gnostic sects make images of Christ, and that when they make these images of Christ, that they have ways of honoring them, and that they honor them in the manner of the Gentiles. The manner of the Gentiles is like saying they do things that pagans do. This is a clear condemnation of the practice of making images of Jesus and honoring them in some manner. So this is clear iconography, and it's not just art. It is iconography that is interacted with in some religious way, like given honor and that sort of thing. And this is a thing that the Gentiles do. The Christians don't do this, in Irenaeus's opinion. The Christians do not make images and they do not honor them like this. And so I feel like Irenaeus is an extremely important person in the 2nd century for both Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism. Like I said, in Catholicism, I think there's like 5 doctors of the church total, and Irenaeus is one of them. If I got that number slightly wrong, feel free to correct me. So that's an extremely important quote. So I'm building up this context in our heads of the early church and what they believed about iconography, so that by the time I get to Athanasius, it'll be easier to understand the context and the sort of flavor of the age that Athanasius is saying these things with. So I'm going to quote Clement of Alexandria a couple times here. I think Clement is an extremely important person to quote because he is one of the first major Alexandrian theologians that we're aware of, and he is very influential on later Alexandrian Christian philosophy and theology. And of course, Athanasius himself is from Alexandria, so this is particularly important. So this is a quote from his book, The Instructor. "But what passes beyond the bounds of absurdity is that they have invented mirrors for this artificial shape of theirs, as if it were some excellent work or masterpiece. The deception rather requires a veil thrown over it. For as the Greek fable has it, it was not a fortunate thing for the beautiful Narcissus to have been the beholder of his own image. If Moses commanded men to make not an image to represent God by art, how can these women be right who by their own reflection produce an imitation of their own likeness in order to the falsifying of their faces?" So what's he saying here? He's saying that women should not have mirrors because mirrors make an image of themselves, and they should not beautify their faces with makeup in these mirrors. Why? Because this is connected to the commandment by Moses to not make representations of God by art. This is how iconoclastic the early church was, that they used iconoclastic arguments to say that you can't even look at yourself in the mirror. Like when we're talking about I honestly think, to be fair, that I am less iconoclastic than the early church was. I bet that Clement of Alexandria would look at the background right now of my YouTube video and be like, "Oh, there are pictures of Jesus." Like, to be fair, right? You know, up in that corner over there, or that corner over there, there's an icon of Jesus, and that painting up there is an icon of Jesus. So obviously I'm okay with some level of iconography. If I think that the distinction is between not making it an object of veneration versus just having it artistically. But I honestly think that Clement of Alexandria is further than that. Like I said, he can't even tolerate the practice of looking at yourself in the mirror to put on makeup. So keep that in mind. But there are more important points, honestly. That's just sort of like a shock value quote, honestly, but it sort of gets a point across of the context that we're talking about. This quote I actually feel like is more to the point of a particular theme that I want to talk about. So this is Clement of Alexandria again, and he's writing around the year 200 AD. Clement says, "And again, Don't wear a ring, nor engrave on it the image of the gods, enjoins Pythagoras. So in other words, he's quoting Pythagoras as a support for aniconism. This book is trying to persuade pagan-oriented people to try and be Christian, and so he's quoting Pythagoras to support aniconism. He's not quoting Pythagoras because he thinks it's authoritative for Christians. He's doing sort of an evangelical apologetic thing of you use the sources that someone else respects to try and persuade them of the point you're trying to make, the same way Paul quotes Stoic philosophers when he's talking to Stoic philosophers in Athens. As Moses ages before enacted expressly that neither a graven, nor molten, nor molded, nor painted likeness should be made, so that we may not cleave to these things of sense, but pass to intellectual objects, for familiarity with the sight disparages the reverence of what is divine. And to worship that which is immaterial by matter is to dishonor it by sense. So what's going on here? Obviously, he's quoting Moses and the commandment against graven images, but there's the second reason that he gives, and I think that this is very helpful for understanding Athanasius, that in this age, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism. I'll talk even more about Neoplatonism a little bit coming up later in this video, that, and again, when I'm talking about Neoplatonism, and I'll use that term multiple times, I think, in the rest of this video, I'm not doing it to try and say that these ideas are sourced in pagan philosophy. I think Neoplatonism was especially strong in Alexandria, and it was sort of a swirling together of pagan philosophy and, yes, Plato's writings, but it also had a lot of influence from Judaism. Alexandria had hundreds of thousands of Jews, so there was a big influence of Judaism on Neoplatonic philosophy. And then at this point in time, Christianity's coming into the conversation. So I think there's this sort of three-way combination. I could even throw Egyptian mythology and religion into that as well. So maybe it's a four-way dialogue between Greco-Roman sort of Platonic philosophy, Judaism, Christianity, and Egyptian stuff that's coming together to make this Neoplatonic philosophy. And one of the aspects of this Neoplatonic philosophy that you see in the pagans, the Jews, and the Christians is this idea that God dwells in this realm that is beyond the sensible. So in other words, you can't see God in this sensible realm, but there's this intellectual realm of objects that we are supposed to ascend to with our minds, because our minds can escape this sensual realm and go to the noetic realm. Nous is a word that I'll use as the word for intellect in Greek. And so the noetic realm, the realm of nous, the realm of intellect, is above our realm, and it is more divine. And so we pass through if we ignore our senses, and we almost like, it's like trying to escape your body in a certain sense through intellectual contemplation. And this is what I mean by mystical practice, that this intellectual escape to the higher realm to contemplate the divine objects, or to give reverence of what is divine, requires leaving behind this realm of physical objects and sense and body. And so when you're looking at images, you're keeping your mind down here in the sensible realm of things and stuff and pictures and visual representations and eyeballs. And that's exactly what you don't want to do. You want to leave all that behind and ascend to the higher realm, and images and idols tear you down and bring you back down to the realm of sense. So that's why you should not have idols or even icons, or even look at yourself in the mirror to put on makeup, is that you want to escape these things into the higher intellectual or noetic realm. All right, Origen of Alexandria, he's writing about 50 years later than Clement of Alexandria, says very, very similar things. This is against Celsus or Celsus. Origen is writing he's making a response video, a response book to a Destroying Christianity with Facts and Logic book that Celsus had wrote. So Origen says, and we clearly manifest the illustrious nature of our origin, and do not, as Celsus imagines, conceal it. When we impress upon the minds of our first converts a contempt for idols and images of all kinds, and besides this, raise their thoughts from the worship of created things instead of God, and elevate them to the universal creator. So when Christians, or when people go through the catechesis process to become Christians, Origen says we teach in them a contempt for idols and images of all kinds. What kinds of images does that sentence exclude? It doesn't seemingly exclude any kinds of images. It's not like Origen is saying there are Christian images over here, which are perfectly fine. Origen is saying we teach them to contempt for images of all kinds. I don't know how that could be any clearer. And part of the reason is that we need to escape this realm of created things and elevate ourselves to the realm of the creator. And again, so the motivation for aniconism is this intellectual ascent through the mind to the noetic realm to be closer to our creator, and images and idols and the worship of created things drag us down as opposed to allowing us to ascend. Exact same point that Clement of Alexandria was making. All right, so here is a further quote from Origen of Alexandria. For neither painter nor image maker existed in their state. He's talking about the state of Israel in Old Testament times. I should also say, slight crossfire at Jonathan Pageau, image maker here could also be translated as icon carver. For neither painter nor icon carver existed in their state, the law expelling all such from it, that there might be no pretext for the construction of images, an art which attracts the attention of foolish men and which drags down the eyes of the soul from God to earth. There was accordingly among them a law to the following effect: do not transgress the law, and make to yourselves a graven image, any likeness of male or female, either a likeness of any one of the creatures that are upon the earth, or a likeness of any winged fowl that flies under the heaven, or a likeness of any creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, or a likeness of any of the fishes which are in the waters under the earth. So Origen imagines that in Old Testament times, they had no painters, no icon carvers. And what is the purpose of this? Because art of this kind drags down the eyes of the soul. That's a very curious phrase, eyes of the soul, from God to earth. Again, looking at pictures or icons or art keeps us here in the physical material realm, when the goal is this intellectual, contemplative, mystical practice of using our soul to ascend to the noetic realm where it's closer to God. All right, so speaking of Neoplatonism, I've been previously quoting only Christians. Here is a quote from Plotinus of Alexandria. Plotinus is like the main Neoplatonic philosopher. He's like the big guy in Neoplatonism. He's a pagan himself, although he was a contemporary of Origen. Origen was a little bit older than him. There is some evidence, not perfect evidence, but possible evidence that Origen of Alexandria and Plotinus of Alexandria had the same teacher, a guy named Ammonius Saccas, and that some of the convergence of their ideas might be because they had the same teacher. And I think that's honestly entirely possible. I would also suggest that Origen was writing, so, I have that book Against Celsus. It was written in 248 AD. This book by Plotinus is written only 5 years later, right? So same city, same place, almost the exact same time. But again, I think it would be unfair. I think too many people who look at this history think that Christians are just stealing from the Neoplatonists. I think it underestimates how much the Neoplatonists might have been influenced by the Christians and also the Jews. So anyway, this is a long quote from Plotinus. Bear with me, I'll explain it afterwards. And beauty, this beauty, which is also the good, must be posed as the first. Directly deriving from this first is the intellectual principle. Intellectual principle is the Greek word nous, which is preeminently the manifestation of beauty. Through the intellectual principle, soul is beautiful. The beauty in things of a lower order, actions and pursuits, for instance, comes by operation of the shaping soul, which is also the author of the beauty found in the world of sense. For the soul, a divine thing, a fragment, as it were, of the primal beauty, makes beautiful to the fullness of their capacity all things whatsoever that it grasps and molds. I swear I'll explain this in a bit. I've got one more paragraph. If you're like, Sam, what does this have to do with anything? I'll explain to you. It has a lot to do with everything. All right, one more paragraph. Therefore, we must ascend again towards the good, the desired of every soul. Anyone that has seen this knows what I intend when I say that it is beautiful. Even the desire of it is to be desired as a good. To attain it is for those that will take the upward path, who will set all their forces towards it, who will divest themselves of all that we have put on in our descent. So, to those that approach the holy celebrations of the mysteries, there are appointed purifications, and the laying aside of the garments worn before, and the entry into nakedness, until passing on the upward way, all that is other than the God, each in the solitude of himself, shall behold that solitary dwelling existence, the apart, the unmingled, the pure, that from which all things depend, for which all took and live and act and know, the source of life and of intellection and of being. So what's going on here? That might sound really confusing. If you don't know Neoplatonic philosophy, this might sound like a bunch of gobbledygook, but I'm here to try and translate and interpret for you. So in Neoplatonism, there is a threefold hierarchy in the heavens. There, at the highest level of the hierarchy, there is the good or beauty. And so that's kind of like God. He also calls it the God in this same quote. So the Neoplatonists were, in a sense, monotheistic as well. Not all pagans were polytheistic. Many Neoplatonists were monotheistic as well. So at the top of the hierarchy of this good, that's utterly simple, it's utterly beyond everything. The second principle, the second God is another way that they call this. Christians also use that same phrase, is the intellect principle, which is the nous. And so this nous is generated out of the highest principle. And so Plotinus says that the intellect principle, the nous, is preeminently the manifestation of beauty. So beauty is the one, and the nous is the manifestation of beauty that proceeds out of the one. And then the third level of their cosmic hierarchy is the soul. And it says, through the intellect principle, through the nous, the soul is beautiful. So beauty starts at the top with the one. The intellect principle, the nous, also has beauty in it from the one. And then the soul also has beauty in it. And so there's this like cascade of beauty from the highest thing. And then Plotinus calls this the shaping soul. Another phrase is the world soul. That might sound super weird, but basically the world soul is the thing that shapes the world of sense. So in case you hadn't picked up on it, the world of sense is where you and I are right now in Plotinus's system. We are in the world of sense. And above us, primarily, the first thing above us is the world soul, which is the third emanation. And then above that is the nous, which is like the mind or the intellect. And then above that is the one, the highest thing. And so what Plotinus is saying is that we down here in the realm of sense should aspire to ascend. And the way that we do that is with our soul, not with our body, because our body is from the realm of sense, but our soul is from the higher realm. And that we put on our bodies when we descended. Another thing that people don't know, like when people use the phrase the fall to describe Genesis or what happened, what Adam and Eve did in Genesis, you'll notice that in the book of Genesis, the word the fall never actually appears. The reason why Christians call Adam's first sin the fall is because when Origen was commenting on the book of Genesis, he said that allegorically described the fall of our souls into bodies when we stopped beholding in perfect contemplation God the One. So in this Neoplatonic system, which Origen and Plotinus are very similar in Origen's Christian theology, all of our souls originally used to be up in the realm of intellect. And we're perfectly beholding the one, and we're perfectly good. But we had varying levels of affection, and because we didn't have perfect affection, our souls fell, literally fell, descended into bodies in the realm of sense. And when Plotinus says all the things that we have put on in our descent That's the idea that he's talking about. And I know that Father John Behr thinks that Origen didn't believe in the preexistence of souls up in the intellectual realm. It is not, I think that is an impossible idea, honestly, to hold, because Plotinus, who's like his closest peer, is clearly stating that idea. So Origen didn't get this from nowhere. A lot of his peers held it. So all those passages in Origen where it talks about our souls being up above before we came down into our bodies, that's exactly what he means. It's the same descent of the soul because we failed to have perfect attraction to the one in the realm of the intellect. And so what are we to do about this? What are we to do about this is to lay off the garments that we have. In other words, try and escape our bodies pretty much. And we do this by glancing upwards and moving with our soul through this intellectual contemplative practice that I'm talking about, and that we're trying to get back to the solitary dwelling existence, the apart, the unmingled, the pure, that from which all things depend, for which all look and live and act and know. And the way that we do this is through this intellectual contemplation, but it's also through love. And the word love here is eros. So if you know your different words of love, that's sort of like the attractive kind of love. So we use our love to try and ascend through our souls and our nous, our own kind of sub-mind, our sub-intellect, back to the realm of nous that's up above the realm of sense, which we currently dwell in. All right, that's really important for understanding Athanasius and understanding why Athanasius is, in fact, an iconoclast. All right, so I'm going to move on to Athanasius here. So Athanasius, let's see here. All right, yeah, I'll just go into reading this quote. Actually, Athanasius's book called Against the Heathen. This is actually the first part of On the Incarnation. People forget On the Incarnation, which is Athanasius's most famous book, has two parts. The first book is called Against the Heathen, and the second book is called On the Incarnation. And people almost never read Against the Heathen, but I feel like that's the better part of the book, honestly. I feel like On the Incarnation is interesting, but Against the Heathen, I think, is way more interesting. Although, honestly, a lot of the ideas in Athanasius, I wouldn't call Athanasius a first-rate philosopher theologian. I think that he was more of a politician than a philosopher or a theologian, and that basically all of his ideas are very similar to people around him at the time. And so I think that, anyway, a lot of his quotes, people read Athanasius and are like, wow, this is brilliant. This is so unique. This is so different from the Christianity I'm familiar with, which it is. But if you read a lot of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century church people, you'll find that Athanasius actually looks very familiar in a lot of ways, and that a lot of what he's saying is sort of kind of stock, quotes and ideas about how to argue with pagans that other people before him honestly did a little bit better, especially Origen was better than he was. Anyway, so here's this book, quote from chapter 2 of Against the Heathen. He is awestruck as he contemplates that providence, which through the word extends to the universe, being raised above the things of sense and every bodily appearance, but cleaving to the divine and thought perceived things in the heavens by the power of his mind. The he here is a Christian, like an ideal Christian. So what does this sound like? Certainly sounds a lot like Plotinus. And again, my point here isn't Athanasius got his ideas from paganism. I'm just saying that there is this Neoplatonic stew that Athanasius was cooked in that is a mixture of Christian ideas and pagan ideas and Jewish ideas. So I'm not trying to say, he's pagan, so therefore I win. That's not the point that I'm making. But I'm saying that he has basically the same worldview that Plotinus quote has, just with Christian words instead of, pagan words. So don't misunderstand the point that I'm trying to make by comparing him to Plotinus. I'm not just trying to slap him with a pagan label. But you'll notice that there is this exalted realm that is above the things of sense and bodily appearance, and we cleave to this divine realm through the powers of our mind. That's exactly that same sort of Neoplatonic contemplation that we see in Origen and Plotinus. For when the mind of men does not hold converse with bodies, nor has mingled with it from without anything of their lust, but is wholly above them, dwelling with itself as it was made to begin with, then transcending these things of sense and all things human, it is raised up on high. And seeing the Word, it sees in him also the Father of the Word, taking pleasure in contemplating him, and gaining renewal by its desire toward him, exactly as the first of men created. The one who was named Adam in Hebrew is described in the Holy Scriptures as having at the beginning had his mind to God word in a freedom unembarrassed by shame, and as associating with the holy ones in that contemplation of things perceived by the mind, which he enjoyed in the place where he was, the place which the holy Moses called in a figure a garden. So purity of soul is sufficient of itself to reflect God, as the Lord also says, blessed are in the pure heart, for they shall see God. So again, this is very similar to this Neoplatonic stuff, that if we have a perfect soul, and that if we aren't, thinking about worldly things, thinking about lust, thinking about the things of body, thinking about the things in this created realm, then naturally our soul does what it wants to do, what it's made to do, what it used to do, is to behold contemplatively God. And you'll notice that when he says that this is called the garden, you'll notice in that quote from Plotinus that Plotinus has this realm, which he calls the apart, the unmingled, the pure, from which all things depend, right? That's the realm that you're trying to get to in this intellectual contemplation, this perfect place. You'll notice that Athanasius says that Genesis calls it a garden, but it's in a figure. In other words, the garden is a figure or an analogy or an allegory for this realm where our minds and our souls naturally want to be if they weren't dragged down by all of this worldliness. But also I should talk about Christology here, because what's interesting is that our minds can't directly behold God the Father, even when we get up to the garden, as Athanasius calls it. Even if our minds were to ascend all the way to the garden, what we see when we get up there, and again, the garden is an analogy for the intellectual realm, what we behold there is the Word, in other words, the pre-incarnate Jesus. So yes, Athanasius believes in the pre-incarnate Jesus, shocker. And that when you contemplate then the Word, because the Word is the image of the Father, then you see the Father through the Word, but you can't even ever actually see the Father directly. It's that you see the Father through the Word, but you don't see the Father when you're looking at pictures of Jesus in your church on earth. That would be to drag you down into these worldly things. You see the Father when you see Jesus contemplatively, I'm struggling with that word, through your nous, through intellectual contemplation. So to connect that more with aniconism, here's a couple other quotes. For he also, as long as he kept his mind to God and the contemplation of God, turned away from the contemplation of the body. But when, by counsel of the serpent, this is about Adam, but when, by counsel of the serpent, he departed from the consideration of God and began to regard himself, then they not only fell to bodily lust, but knew that they were naked, and knowing were ashamed. So again, you have this idea that Adam originally had perfect contemplation of God. You get the same thing when Origen comments on this passage, that our souls used to be up in this perfect place. But when we fell from contemplation, and how do you fall from contemplation? You start considering worldly things, and you start thinking about bodies and your own body. And then this is awareness of your own body becomes shame about your own nakedness. And it's also interesting, like there's this really interesting connection between nakedness and this sort of awareness of your body. Even Plotinus talked about how we need to like sort of re-enter this naked state where we aren't ashamed of our bodies. We need to like take off the clothes, take off the garments of skin, as Jonathan Pageau might say, and that we sort of, when we get unashamed of our nakedness again, then we're able to like sort of peel off even our bodies themselves and move back up to God. So this, the connection between nakedness and shame and clothing and body is really interesting. I mean, I find this all fascinating. I also find it somewhat bizarre and almost terrifying, but I also find it interesting at the same time. All right. So connect this more to iconography, Sam. You haven't connected Athanasius to actually talking about iconography. You need to do that a little bit more. Okay, challenge accepted. So this is from chapter 19. He talks more specifically about images and stuff. For what other form do they give them by sculpture but that of men and women and of creatures lower yet and of irrational nature? All manner of birds, beasts, both tame and wild, and creeping things, whatsoever land and sea and the whole realm of water of the waters produce. For men have fallen into the unreasonableness of their passions and pleasures, and unable to see anything beyond pleasures and lusts of the flesh, inasmuch as they keep their mind in the midst of these irrational things. They imagined the divine principle to be in irrational things, and carved a number of gods to match the variety of their passions. So again, there's this really strong connection between being passionate, being attentive to your body, and then making images of things down here in creation to have your sort of divine love that should be going towards God. It's now getting focused on these images of carved things down here below. All right, continuing on. As to which those who pass for philosophers and men of knowledge among the Greeks, while driven to admit that their visible gods are forms and figures of men and of irrational objects, say in defense that they have such things to the end that by their means the deity may answer them and be made manifest, because otherwise they could not know the invisible God save by such statues and rites. So Athanasius criticizes icons at first, saying that, oh, they're of irrational beings and things like alligators and other sorts of stuff like that. How silly is that? And then he says, some of the pagans, though, have a better answer than the sort of uneducated pagans. Some of their philosophers say, well, actually, the purpose of these forms and figures, of these visible gods, their icons and their idols, is that we use them that by means the deity may answer to us. So in other words, they're a realm of communication, or a manner of communication to the higher realm. What does that sound like? That sounds like that first quote that Gavin said that I played at the very beginning of this video, because otherwise they could not know the invisible God. So he's saying that some philosophically sophisticated pagans had the idea that these images are just sort of portals or ways of manifesting God to get him to do what we want. But we know that God is himself invisible and is not actually that object that we made. But Athanasius doesn't find that idea persuasive either. So the point that I said at the video that I played at the very beginning that Lord of Spirits didn't quite understand is, my point was, Athanasius criticizes philosophically sophisticated pagan defenses of iconography, and his criticisms would seemingly also be criticisms of Christian iconography if Christian iconography were to exist, which suggests that it's more likely then that Athanasius did not believe in Christian iconography. That's not an argument from silence. That's more sophisticated than an argument from silence. And that's what Lord of Spirits didn't seem to understand was actually my point all along. I'm not done yet. All right. While those who profess to give still deeper and more philosophical reasons than these say, so Athanasius is saying, all right, there's unsophisticated pagans. They have bad reasons for doing iconography. All right, there's some philosophically sophisticated pagans who give that reason I just read. He's not persuaded by it. All right, there's an even more sophisticated level of argument that the pagan philosophers give to defend this. All right, so what's that? That the reason of idols being prepared and fashioned is for the invocation and manifestation of divine angels and powers, that appearing by these means, they may teach men concerning the knowledge of God, and that they serve as letters for men, by referring to which they may learn to apprehend God, from the manifestation of the divine angels effected by their means. Such then is their mythology. For far be it from us to call it a theology, but if one examines the argument with care, he will find that the opinion of these persons also, not less than that of those previously spoken of, is false. So what's he saying here? This highest level of sophisticated pagans says that, that these images and idols aren't of God, because that would be silly because God's invisible. They're instead images of angels and other intermediary beings. And if you might say, well, Sam, the Catholics and the Orthodox, their icons are of human beings who have gone up to heaven. Not all of them. Many of them are also of angels. They do have icons of angels too. And they do pray and venerate and bow down to images that are of angels in heaven. And this is something that, this is again my point. Athanasius is criticizing having images of angels such that you might interact with them and thereby gain, you could call it a window into heaven through these images of angels. If the Christians in Athanasius's church had images of, the Archangel Gabriel or something like that, he would have to give some explanation of why his images of angels are different than the pagan images of angels, but he finds no such need to do that. And in fact, he just calls it mythology and obviously false. And again, that's my argument. Athanasius is criticizing philosophically sophisticated pagans who make very similar arguments as the Lord of Spirits do to defend iconography. But Athanasius isn't using those arguments positively. He's arguing against those arguments that are coming from pagans. And it's not just that they're pagans, it's that he thinks it's bad theology writ large. He's not just like, oh, your images are of false angels and are of true angels or something like that. Or you have images of evil, bad people like Hercules, and we have images of Jesus and Peter and Paul. That's not what he's saying. He says that all of this is hooey and hogwash. That's my paraphrase translation. All right, not done yet. But as to the second, as to their second, and as they say, profounder defense. In other words, he's going to argue more against that argument that I just laid out in the last quote. So he's going into more detail on that quote. As to their second, and as they say, profounder defense, one might reasonably add as follows. If these things are made by you Greeks, not for the sake of a self-manifestation of God himself, but for the sake of a presence there of angels, why do you rank these images? Again, the word images is the word icon. Why do you rank these icons by which you invoke the powers as superior and above the powers invoked? For you carved the figures for the sake of the apprehension of God, as you say, but invest the actual images with the honor and title of God, thus placing yourselves in a profane position. For while confessing that the power of God transcends the littleness of the images, and for that reason not venturing to invoke God through them, but only the lesser powers, you yourselves leap over these latter and have bestowed upon stocks and stones the title of him whose presence you feared, and call them gods instead of stones and men's workmanship and worship them. And again, I think the word worship there is actually probably proskuneo and probably bow down. Could be wrong. I should have looked that up before saying that, but that's my guess. So anyway, this sounds exactly like what Protestants say when we criticize Catholics and Orthodox. You guys are giving too much attention to these intermediary beings, and you should be paying more attention to God. You say that these images and icons allow you a way to get to know God better through those whom you are depicting, but instead you give too much attention to them and almost treat them as if they are God. Okay, he sounds like a Protestant criticizing the icons, but it's not. This isn't a Protestant criticizing Catholics. This is Athanasius criticizing pagans. But all the arguments would seem to apply to Christian iconography as well as pagan iconography. Again, that whole point that I was trying to make in that little clip that Lord of Spirits seemingly didn't get the full gist of what I was saying. This is what I was trying to say. All right, I'm going to play another clip of myself to give myself a water break, but also because I'm not sure if I need to say it any better than what I already said. This is about, I think that understanding this contemplative practice, this mysticism that you could say that Athanasius has, I think this is one of the keys of understanding the Arian crisis. And I'll explain in this clip right here. This is me and Hank again.
And another thing that I want to say is that Athanasius really believes that we first behold the word, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like in our intellectual contemplation, we behold the word in our mind. We think about Jesus, the word. And then when we think about Jesus, the word, because Jesus is the image of God, because he is the image of the invisible God, we then behold God, right? So your mind, your first thought should be of Jesus. And then from Jesus, through Jesus, you see God, right? That's Athanasius's mysticism. But if you remember, Arius said that the word can't even contemplate God, right? That God is so ineffable that even the logos or the word can't describe God. even the Logos, even Jesus himself, pre-incarnate, post-incarnate, whatever, cannot fully understand God because God is too beyond comprehension. And I actually, when I was reading this, I'm like, I actually think that Athanasius's main motivation for disagreeing with Arius and Arianism was a mystical motivation. That Athanasius believes that when you behold Jesus in your intellectual contemplation, in your mystical practice, you behold God, right? And that the word does communicate God to us, right? That there is this strong connection between God and the word, and that the word faithfully communicates God, and that we can behold God positively. Yeah. Whereas Arius would say, no, you cannot behold God through the word, because the God is so much higher and other and beyond the word that we can behold the word, and that's all well and good. But there's this ontological gap between the word and God that we can only speak negatively about God. So Arius and an Arian would have a negative mystical practice where they could only say apophatically, God is not this, God is not that. We can't say true things about God because of his ineffability. Whereas an Athanasian would say that no, we can behold God, and to say that you're not beholding God when you're beholding Jesus is to do you a disservice and to get stuck in this mistake of only beholding lowly things and not transcending to the highest thing. I actually think that is Athanasius's biggest beef with Arianism, and why.
Well said, Sam from the past. So let's see here. I think that, I should say, right, I described Plotinus's threefold thing where he has the one and nous and then the soul. In Origen and later Christians, that's just very quickly mapped to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So I will say, I don't want to over stress that Neoplatonism is just pagan in origin and that it's just a pagan system that infiltrated Christianity. I think that's too simplistic of a narrative, honestly. But I do think that threefold hierarchy in heaven, which seems to mostly date from a guy named Numenius in the 1st century BC, who was a pagan Platonic philosopher, I do think that heavenly triad idea is the thing that will come to shape the doctrine of the Trinity, even though the Nicene, again, I actually don't think that the Council of Nicaea affirmed the doctrine of the Trinity. I should say the Constantinopolitan definition of the Trinity is modified and different from that Neoplatonic triad, but that Neoplatonic triad is really what gives shape to the doctrine of the Trinity, mapping those Platonic terms to Christian terms of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Anyway, that's just a little bit of an aside. Okay, Athanasius, 320 AD, Against the Heathen, chapter 34. All right, this is a really important passage for understanding Athanasius's what I call mysticism, or his spiritual path that he recommends for people. But turn back they can, and they is really any humans who are living in sin. If they lay aside the filth of all lust which they have put on, and wash it away persistently until they have got rid of all the foreign matter that has affected their soul, and can show it in its simplicity as it was made, that so they may be able by it to behold the word of the Father, after whose likeness they were originally made. For the soul is made after the image and likeness of God, as divine scripture also shows. When it says in the person of God, let us make man after our image and likeness, whence also when it gets rid of all the filth of sin, which covers it, and retains only the likeness of the image in its purity, then surely this latter, being thoroughly brightened, the soul beholds as in a mirror the image of the Father, even the Word, and by his means reaches the idea of the Father, whose image the Savior is. Again, this is this contemplative practice that our souls are originally supposed to be in the realm of intellect, or nous, or logos, or the Son, because we are made after the image of the Son. The Son is like the archetypal nous, and we are like little nooses. The Son is the archetypal logos, and we are little logoses, but we have gotten covered in filth and sin because we keep looking around at all this stuff down here and looking at all these images and looking at all these idols and all of this idolatry and image veneration that just keeps you down here in your bodies. The goal is to escape back up to the intellectual realm from where our soul derives and where it is supposed to be. But all of us have the ability to do that. I think another really fascinating thing, I think it's funny how Calvinists tend to like using Athanasius strictly when it comes to Trinitarian questions, but they have no idea how different his theology is from theirs. He has basically no doctrine of original sin. He still thinks that all humans are actually made inherently good, that we've gotten this sin on us through bad things that have happened, but it's just perfectly easy to wash this sin off us. And once we wash this sin off us, then we'll immediately start beholding God again, and we'll get back to doing what we were supposed to have been doing all along. There is no total depravity. There's only this kind of thin veneer of sin over our inherent goodness. Like, I think Martin Luther said that we are a little bit of snow over a pile of dung to describe human beings. In other words, on the inside, we're actually deeply bad. It just, we kind of look good on the outside. Athanasius is the reverse. There's this thin veneer of sin, but underneath we're really good. And we just wash off the thin veneer of sin, then we will be good again. So here's another quote. All right. The tenets we have been speaking of have been proved to be nothing more than a false guide for life. He's talking about paganism. But the way of truth will aim at reaching the real and true God. But for its knowledge and accurate comprehension, there is no need of none others save ourselves. Neither as God himself is above all, is the road to him afar off or outside ourselves, but it is in us, and it is possible to find it from ourselves. In the first instance, as Moses also taught when he said, Deuteronomy 30:14, the word of faith is within your heart, which is the very thing the Savior declared and confirmed when he said, the kingdom of God is within you. For having in ourselves faith and the kingdom of God, we shall be able quickly to see and perceive the King of the universe, the saving word of God. Let not the Greeks who worship idols make excuses, nor let anyone else simply deceive himself, professing to have no such road and therefore finding a pretext for his godlessness. For we all have set foot upon it and have it, even if not all are willing to travel by it, but rather to swerve from it and go wrong, because of the pleasures of life which attract them from without. And if one were to ask, what road is this? I say it is the soul of each one of us, and the intelligence, the nous, which resides there. For by it alone can God be contemplated and perceived. So this is a very different doctrine of salvation. Athanasius doesn't think we need someone to come down and save us from our sin and wash away our inherent guilt. The road back to God is already there in all of us. All of us have the path before us that we could turn to if we chose to. If we laid aside sin and laid aside worldly pleasure, all of us have the opportunity to return back to contemplating God through our soul, in which we have a nous, which desires to be up in the noetic realm. And so you might say, what's the role of the incarnation then for Athanasius? Well, that's what the whole second book is about. And he has a whole chapter on why Jesus had to be crucified. And the main answer that he has is to prove his own deity. For Athanasius, the reason why the word came down and became flesh was not to serve as a penal substitutionary atonement for our sin. He doesn't believe in penal substitutionary atonement at all. He doesn't even really think that Jesus died for our sins, really, in the way that most Protestants are familiar with. He thinks that basically, imagine there's a professor teaching a class, and all the students are in the audience, and they're looking at their phones, they're passing notes to each other, they're eating snacks, they're goofing off, they're not paying attention to the professor. They're supposed to be paying attention to the professor, but the professor can't get their attention. So the professor leaves the lectern and goes out into the lecture hall and starts tapping them on the shoulder and saying, hey, stop doing that. Stop looking at your phone. Stop typing on your computer. Stop passing notes. Stop eating those snacks. Pay attention to what I'm saying. He goes out into the audience. And the whole point for Athanasius is that Jesus does miracles and rises from the dead to prove that he was, in fact, the word from the higher realm, so that you would listen to what he had to say. It's like the professor saying, look, here's my ID badge that shows that I am, in fact, the professor of this class. Listen to me. Listen to the lecture up front. Get back to paying attention to the class and stop goofing off. That's sort of Athanasius's whole view of life, is that our bodies are just a way of goofing off. and that what we really need to do is use our soul to escape back to the higher realm of nous, where we're supposed to be beholding the Word, and by beholding the Word, we're beholding the Father. And we had gotten so bad at that the Word himself had to come down and snap us out of our goofing off to try and get us to pay attention again. And the crucifixion was just a giant exclamation sign of him proving who he was. There is no real actual blood atonement in Athanasius. That's his theology. It is like so shockingly different from Calvinism. It's almost hard to even call it the same religion. So anyway, I'm not the biggest fan of Athanasius, but I think a lot of the people who think they are fans of Athanasius would be shocked if they actually really thought about what he believed and really read what he said. But that's it. And so that's my argument. Athanasius believes that we need to stop goofing off, stop looking at the material realm, stop paying attention to the senses of our body, and contemplate the intellectual realm, which is the Logos, which is the Son of God, the image of the invisible God. And thereby doing, our nous will return to where it's supposed to be, and then we can contemplate God the Father through the Word. That is Athanasius's theology and mysticism and philosophy. It's not unique to him. You can find the exact same thing really in Origen. You can find the exact same thing in Clement of Alexandria. You can even find it in Plotinus, really, although not with Christian words, but it's the same general idea. And that for him, images, Christian, pagan, or otherwise, are distractions that keep our senses down here. And all we need to do, the path to God is within us. We don't need images to get there. We have the path within our soul back up to God, not from without. And so paying attention to your eyeballs by looking at an image of Jesus or of Paul or of the Archangel Michael or whatever, that would be a distraction. That would be a waste of time, or even worse than a waste of time. It would keep you within your body. And the whole point is to not do that. That's why Athanasius is an iconoclast. That was my point in the video. And I think that the Lord of Spirits did not accurately understand what I was saying, nor portray my point very accurately, although I will gladly accept their compliments on my intelligence and my excitement for making that argument. Thank you very much. Father Stephen DeYoung, I'd love to talk to you again sometime. Gavin, love to talk to you too. Jordan B. Cooper, if you're out there, I'd love to talk to you too, but I'm done bothering you for now. All right. Thank you very much for listening.